because he was too ordinary looking. He could only choose the day of graduation. He tricked the boy he'd been in love with for 4 years into coming home to end his regrets. But the boy's rationality was more than he could have imagined. He just held Heather in his arms and talked to her all night. Until dawn, Jim told her that there can be pure friendship between people of the opposite sex. He made a pact with Heather that they would see each other every year on the 15th of July. Although Heather didn't want to accept the pact, but she didn't refuse to meet the boy, because she believed in her heart of hearts that there's no such thing as a pure friendship. She also believed that a boy would fall in love with her on the 15th of July one year, and then on the 15th of July of the following year, Heather moved to London for her dream of writing. Jim also decided to travel abroad on that day to experience a different life. Before he left, Jim asked Heather to send him more letters and to encourage her that her writing would be a success. Heather didn't answer, but the smile on her face told the story of her happiness. But by the 15th of July of her third year, Heather had gone from being a graduate with big dreams. Heather had gone from being a graduate with high aspirations to working as an order taker in a restaurant to make ends meet. The harsh reality made him suspend his literary dreams. Every day in the kitchen, full of fumes, in a kitchen full of grease and fumes, her life became monotonous and boring, and she lost all hope and motivation for the future. Heather could only call Jim for comfort. She felt that London was swallowing her up, and Jim, who was in a foreign country, could only call her to comfort her, give her hope for tomorrow. Give yourself a little bit of motivation. Jim's ordinary words gave Heather a sense of hope. He gave her hope that she could overcome this moment. By the time their call was over, Heather could only say a secret word to Jim.
I miss you.
When the 10th of July arrived, Jim had taken a break from traveling to come to London, where Heather was, and the years of traveling had made him a loose cannon, and he had a flamboyant streak in him. While he waited for Heather to get off work, he became intimate with a stranger. Heather was devastated when she saw it. She tried to reprimand Jim for his behavior, but then she realized they weren't related. He could only take out his frustration in a joking manner.
You were trying to fit her entire head in your mouth.
At this point in her life, Heather was still in a big city daze. Jim could tell right away that she was dead in the water. He encouraged Heather to get out and see the world. She shouldn't be wasting her youth here. But as soon as Heather smelled the cheese and grease on her head, she'd given up on change. The job took away her ability to think about reality, and it made her lose the courage to face her dreams. Jim recognized Heather's concern and came to her side. He kissed her on the forehead as a way to ease her confusion, and embraced her as a reassurance that she was ready to face life. But Jim still thought of Heather as a friend of the opposite sex. He wanted Heather to quit her job. She's too good a writer to be working here. She just needed a chance. Looking into Jim's serious eyes, Heather knew he had no chance of refusing. And then it was the 15th of July. They went on holiday together to the seaside. To protect this precious friendship, Heather and Jim made a pact that they would not sleep together or flirt with each other during the holiday. It was Heather who made the pact, but it also made her feel conflicted, because both of those things were what she wanted deep down inside. The sea breeze was blowing. They finally made it to the beach. Heather was alone with her sunscreen when Jim saw her, and he naturally came up behind Heather to help her apply it. At that moment, Heather had a smile on her face. It was a heartfelt feeling of happiness. Her heart couldn't stop pounding, as if it hadn't felt that way in a long time. They were enjoying the time together on the beach, and they played with each other in the room, unabashedly. As the sun set and night fell, they shared their thoughts with the sound of the waves and the sea breeze. At this romantic moment, Heather finally found the courage and confessed everything to Jim through the power of alcohol. The first time I spoke to you in the snow, I fell in love with you at first sight. But Heather's confession was not reciprocated by Jim. Maybe he didn't want the closeness to become a conflict between them, or maybe he really just wanted to be friends with Heather. Until they walked all the way from the pub to the beach, Jim didn't know how to answer Heather, and he was trying to get Heather to back off with his debauchery. He took off his clothes behind Heather and jumped right into the pool. At the shocking behavior, Heather was shocked, but when she saw that Jim had been taunting him about his cowardice and weakness, she jumped into the pool more often than she should have. The sea brought them refreshment and happiness, and Jim figured out how to respond to Heather. Looking at her with such affection, Heather seemed to have the answer she was looking for.
I think about you. You and me.
Really?
The problem is I fancy pretty much everyone.
When Heather heard that, a tear came to her eye. She could only hide her sadness with a forced lie. Maybe Jim was trying to use his flirtatiousness as a reason to reject her, or maybe he was afraid that love would be the cause of their separation. A year went by in a hurry. Jim became a popular TV presenter. He lived an enviable life. He was surrounded by beautiful women. He was always on the go, and he always used alcohol to numb his brain. Whenever he got drunk, he couldn't help but dial Heather's number. He didn't show any concern or ask any questions. He just said goodnight. And every time Heather got a call from Jim, her heart swells with anticipation. But when she heard only goodnight, she was so disappointed. She felt she'd been played. When Jim was sober, he longed to tell Heather what was on his mind. But when the words came out, he couldn't express those feelings. As time passed, and the distance between them grew, the promised meeting on the 15th of July became a telephone conversation. On the 15th of July 1994, Jim returned home in a hurry because his mother was seriously ill, but he had just found the time to visit her. Looking at his mother's haggard appearance, his stepmother tried to comfort her, but the long hours of pleasure seems to have made him forget to care for others. Mother advised him to go back to the old days, to be the cheerful and sunny man he once was, and not to be exposed to a life of dissipation. His father was disappointed in him and repossessed his car. He wanted him to find a wife and live in peace. With guilt and sadness, Jim called Heather, wanting to let Heather heal his pain after a long absence. But he didn't know Heather had already left him. She'd accepted a guy who'd been courting her for a long time. Heather knew that she wasn't in love with him, but he could always love him, to be there for her when she was sad. When he was in trouble, he was there for her. She was satisfied. At least she could make him forget about his unrequited love for Jim and the endless pain and sadness. It was the first time Jim had heard from Heather. He could only use alcohol to forget his sadness. Jim's drunken ramblings were repetitive. Heather didn't take it seriously. When Heather moved in with her boyfriend and started a new life, she thought it would help her forget about Jim, but she still watched Jim's show on TV on time. And when she saw Jim and heard his voice, she'd feel an ache in her heart, as if he lost something precious, and she couldn't let it go. On the 15th of July, when they had been apart for 2 more years, Heather took the initiative to ask Jim to dinner at the restaurant. She thought that this meeting after a long absence would be the same as the last trip, and full of joy and happiness. But what she didn't expect, that Jim would get even crazier. He didn't even notice how well he was dressed. And at dinner, Heather noticed that even sober Jim was rambling just as much, and frequent trips to the bathroom. During his time with him, he was still flirting with strange women, as if he didn't give a damn about the meeting. Look at the disdain on his face, and even spoke in a very rude manner. Heather couldn't hold back her anger any longer and left the table. She berated Jim for his changes. She blamed him for the way he got drunk every day, and she didn't want to say another word to Jim. Looking at the back of Heather's angry departure, Jim went after her and tried to explain, but what he didn't expect was for Heather to get even angrier. "I want a boyfriend, to get over the hurt of having a crush on you, but I didn't realize until the end I was stuck in a house with someone I didn't love. If we meet this time, you won't even talk to me. What's the point of me seeing you?" Heather wanted to just leave and cut ties with him, but she couldn't let go.
I love you, Dexter. So much. I just don't like you anymore.
Heather's words threw Jim for a loop. He still didn't understand what Heather meant. In the days that followed, they stopped talking to each other, and that break lasted for years. Heather began to improve herself, and she started writing again. But the story she wrote to Jim was accidentally discovered by her boyfriend, and they broke up in an argument. And Jim went from a hit show to a late-night show, until he was fired from the station for being a nervous wreck, and was left penniless. It didn't seem like Heather and Jim's lives had changed, but it seemed to have changed a lot. By the time the 15th of July 2000 rolled around, they were reunited at a friend's wedding, but Jim had a fiancée, and Heather was still alone. Jim looked at Heather, with whom he used to talk about everything. He felt a sense of regret and despair. He didn't know if he loved his fiancée. He just felt that life had become dull and uninteresting. He just wanted to get on with his life. And when Heather saw Jim's happiness, she felt an indescribable sadness. But when they sit down together, and then they would sit together and tease each other, as if they didn't care about each other's lives. But there was a tinge of sadness and regret in their eyes. Can't be hidden. It's easy for anyone to detect. The wedding was coming to a climax, but Jim quietly took Heather to the rooftop. They hadn't seen each other in a long time. It's amazing how much they've changed. Jim had lost his flirtatious streak. Gone was the boy with the bone-crushing arrogance. Instead, he was a mature man. He took out an invitation and handed it to Heather. He wanted Heather to come to his wedding, to witness the most important moment of his life. And when Heather saw the invitation, it was as if the world had suddenly stopped. He couldn't believe it was real. But then he smiled and gave his best wishes, and he watched as Jim broke free from the madness and get his life back on track. Heather was so happy for her, but the uncontrollable tears in her eyes. She didn't know if it was because she didn't want to let her go, or if she was truly touched by the marriage of her longtime friend. But no matter what, they're still with each other. A year later, Jim became a father without a decent job. She had to commute by bus every day. She lived a busy, hard life, but Jim didn't complain. Every day he worked hard in the restaurant, even though his position is insignificant in the eyes of others. Though the days are hard and the baby is tired, but he still feels happy and satisfied, because he knew that his family was all he had to offer. But fate played a cruel joke on Jim. His wife's infidelity destroyed his family and Jim. Time goes by. The years went by like clockwork. When the hands of time pointed to the 15th of July 2003, Jim had ended his short-lived marriage to his wife. This painful marriage had left him heartbroken. The gray hairs on his head were like frost on snow. The haggard look of his face was pitiful, but Jim still tried to look his best, trying to look his best for Heather. He searched the halls for Heather, and Heather, who had cut off her long hair and made it short, was waiting for Jim to arrive. Looking at the short-haired Heather in front of him, Jim felt like he was seeing a new Heather, a writer who had realized her dream. He used his hands as he had done before, with his hands, as he had done in the past, but time seemed to have cut a deep chasm between them and made them strangers. Looking at the mature Heather in front of him, Jim couldn't help but confess his feelings, to reveal the real reason he was looking for him, and the emotional mystery that had been hidden for 15 years. Heather interrupted Jim to explain that she already had a boyfriend, and a famous musician in London. Jim's heart swells with sadness and grief. He followed Heather around, asking questions about the man, trying to understand the story of their relationship, but he couldn't express his true feelings. He could only listen to Heather's story, as Heather threw herself into the arms of the musician and chose to go on a date. Jim knew there was nothing he could do to change that, but to leave in despair. Despite being in a familiar city, he felt an inexplicable sense of sadness. He walked the streets of London alone, remembering all the things he'd been through, and realized how much Heather meant to him. But as he remembered his own behavior, he understood the unspeakable pain in Heather's heart. And Heather, who was dating a musician, because of Jim's presence, his heart was in turmoil again. He didn't want to give up on Jim, because he knew that this might be the last time he'd ever see him. On one side was his ordinary life. On the other hand, there was his unknown love. Heather was in deep conflict, but in order to make up for the regrets of his youth, Heather made a choice deep down in his heart. He decided to bravely pursue his love. On the 15th of July 2004, Heather and Jim decided to give each other a legal identity. They knew that this day is not only a testimony of their love, it was the beginning of a new life for them. On the 15th of July 2006, they had been married for 2 years. Their life after marriage wasn't as quarrelsome as they imagined. On the contrary, they are getting happier and happier. They seem to want to recover the regrets of the past, to make up for those lost moments with the companionship of this moment. The triviality and humdrum of life didn't kill their love. On the contrary, it has become a whetstone for their emotions. It makes their love shine even brighter. They also plan to have another child, with the fruit of their love, to add more happiness and warmth to their family. But one day, Heather received a phone call from Jim, and that changed everything. Jim planned for them to go out for a nice dinner first, and then go see a good film to add happiness to their lives. After hearing Jim's plan, Heather excitedly rode her bike to the restaurant. She couldn't wait to spend this special day with him. But what he didn't realize was that this day would be the day he would say goodbye to Jim forever. At the end of his life,
在生命的最
Heather's
后一
eyes were still
刻，
filled
孩
with
子的
thoughts
眼
of
中
Jim.
依然
His
是对
dream had
继
just
母
come
无尽的
true.
思念
His。
他
happiness
的梦
had
想
just
刚刚
begun.
实现。
But then an accident took it all away. 18 years of love, with all its twists and turns. But at this moment it came to an abrupt end. There was no more to come. Heather's death left Yeager in tears, and he lost the courage and meaning to face life. On the 15th of July 2007, Jim was back to being the confused man he was before. His eyes were filled with confusion and pain, as if he had lost his soul. He used alcohol every day to numb himself, to forget that Heather was gone. But the alcohol didn't help him. It drove him deeper into despair. On the dance floor, he got into a fight with someone. He lost control of his emotions and started a fight. He was beaten up. His face was completely disfigured. His ex-wife looked at him in a state of disarray. She felt pity for him. She couldn't help but reassure him to move on. After all, he had his daughter with him. But Jim couldn't get over the pain of losing Heather, and his father encouraged him to find the courage to face life again. He told Jim Heather wouldn't want to see him like this. His father's words left Jim in deep thought. He remembered how after his mother died, after his mother's death, his father lived alone for more than 10 years. Jim suddenly understood. Some people are like a brand, deeply imprinted in our souls. No matter how much time passes, we can't let them go. But if that's the case, why don't we take his memory with us, to chase after the starry sea that belongs to us? On the 15th of July 2009, Jim, after much pain and struggle, he finally took Heather's memories with him. And got his life back on track. But on this day, Jim met Heather's ex-boyfriend. The ex-boyfriend told Jim bluntly that he always thought Jim was too good for Heather. He thought Jim was too ordinary and couldn't bring Heather happiness, but now he realized Heather's only happy when she's with Jim. When she's with Jim, that's the only time she has a truly happy smile. A smile that was uniquely Jim's. No one could ever replace it. Looking at his ex-boyfriend's family's happiness, Jim couldn't help but think of Heather. He thought of the first time he met Heather. It was the day he was dragged home by Heather and nothing happened. Heather woke him up in the morning. She took him up to the top of an endless mountain. They were walking slowly along a meadow, and they felt the beauty of nature, the grass on the mountain, and the unobstructed view of the mountains. They were so happy. In this rare moment of tranquility, Jim quietly put his hand over Heather's head and whispered words of love in his ear. It was as if on this day, he had a crush on Heather in his heart. They raced back to the flat. Their hearts were full of love and youthful exuberance. Their steps were light and firm, as if they were chasing the wind. They couldn't wait to make up for last night. But just before they reached the door, Jim's parents interrupted them. They had no choice but to part. But Jim didn't want to part with Heather, because he had got Heiko's contact information. He followed up and asked for Heiko's number. Heather happily wrote down her contact information, even her parents' phone numbers. It seemed like she wanted to know Jim for the rest of his life. It was like a dream that spanned 20 years. Maybe some people are meant to meet, destined to be together. Time won't let them miss each other, because the others never really got into their hearts. Love requires courage and honesty. Don't let subtlety and lack of candor to be the culprits of love's tardiness. Expressing yourself bravely, maybe it'll make love come sooner. Being rejected is not scary. What's scary is that it's the fact that you've been treated as if he's the only one you think of when you're alone. May you find the love of your heart, what your heart desires.